Hello, I would like to welcome you to another conversation in the series The Art of, a series of conversations about art and artists of the ZKM collection. And the title of today's conversation is, now it's getting verbally a little bit redundant, The Art of Living in Conversation. It's a conversation about the cybernetician Gordon Pask, and it's my incredible pleasure to welcome the world's specialists on Gordon Pask, Paul Pangarow and Andrew Pickering. A warm welcome. Before I introduce them, as always, we'll start with a short film about Gordon Pask, a film that attempts to introduce the life and work of an individual in 5 minutes.
Andrew Gordon Speedy Pask was born in 1928 in Derby, England. He studied geology, mining, biology, chemistry, physiology and psychology. Whoever met Pask realized that he was a polymath. Polymath dressed as an Edwardian dandy in a bow tie and cape. A man the Daily Mail characterized as the scientist who never sleeps, given his habit of working 36 hours and then sleeping 12 hours. Thus, Pask published more than 200 papers and 6 books, including the seminal An Approach to Cybernetics. He had not yet turned 30 when he was already one of the leading figures in the field of cybernetics in Great Britain. Internationally, Pask became known for adaptive teaching machines that did not merely run a program, but perceived and responded to the skills of their human counterparts. These inventions were part of his life's project. How do humans learn? How do new concepts emerge?
We've got a duty as educators to instill the basic skills of reading, writing, arithmetic, communication, driving motor cars, working with numbers, knowing about our history, our culture, everything. But also we have a duty which I think isn't forgotten but is overlaid perhaps by the plethora of other things which have to be done, of teaching another skill, perhaps you'd rather call it an art, that of learning to learn.
Pask, who spent most of his student years locked away with strange electrical objects, surrounded by spaghetti-like garlands of electrical wires, in 1953 co-founded the company System Research and started to develop a range of learning machines. Eucrates, Saki, the self-adaptive keyboard instructor, pattern recognition machines, CASED, the course assembly system and tutorial environment, and many others. These machines responded to the students' skills and made different learning strategies accessible for observation. The press painted a picture of a genius surrounded by crazy machines. What makes Pask's work unique is the entanglement of his research with the arts. He was not only a cartoonist, painter and lyricist. In the early 1950s, Pask also co-founded a theatre company called Cybernetic, dedicated to the performance of musical comedies, for which he wrote his own plays and songs. Thus, theatres and dance halls were the first laboratories for his cybernetic experiments. Among the earliest machines was Musicolour, on which Pask and his partner Robin McKinnon Wood worked from 1953. It was a sort of light organ that responded to music in an idiosyncratic way. If the pianist repeated rhythms or frequency spectra for too long, the machine got bored and refused to continue to play along. Its lights stopped responding. It was a moody machine. The effect, the pianist would be encouraged to vary the playing. Musicolour had a hypnotic spell on the musicians, wooing the machine with avenue improvisations. And the machine wooed back, creating an ongoing dance of conversation. In 1964, Pask was brought in as a consultant for one of the most spectacular projects of the 1960s, the Fun Palace by British architect Cedric Price and theatre activist Joan Littlewood. Pask was asked to design the cybernetic control system for the Fun Palace, as the building's walls, floors, stairs and ceiling modules were meant to move and adapt to the desires of the public. He also designed a cybernetic theatre for the Fun Palace, in which the audience would decide the course of each play through an electronic interface. In 1967, Pask was invited by the brilliant curator Joshua Reichardt to develop a project for the exhibition Cybernetic Serendipity, which opened at the ICA London in August 1968. Pask created the Colloquy of Mobiles, a computer-controlled installation of 5 mobiles. He described the colloquy as a parody of the chit-chat at a cocktail party, or the discourse of some bizarre philosophers, or the courting ritual of a strange and stylized animal species. The mobiles conversed via light and sound. Their goal, you may say, was the pursuit of happiness. Visitors could interfere in the courtship using flashlights. Pask was not the first to show robots in an art gallery, but the first to stage a population of learning machines to create what he called an aesthetically potent environment. The Colloquy of Mobiles was dismantled after the exhibition and became a myth. In 2018, Paul Pangarow, then professor at the College for Creative Studies in Detroit, decided to reconstruct the installation in light of its 50th anniversary. It became an extensive research and teaching project. Through the collaboration with the architect T.J. McLeish, the form and behavior of the mobiles were reconstructed using contemporary digital means. In 2020, the Colloquy of Mobiles came to ZKM through a generous donation by Paul Pangarow. It is currently on display in the exhibition Biomedia, the Age of Media with Lifelike Behavior. Both Musicolour and the Colloquy of Mobiles are paradigmatic of Pask's magnum opus, his conversation theory, a theory and practice of learning, of interaction, a theory of theory building. It is important to mention that Pask's conversation theory had a great influence, particularly on architecture, not only through his many years of teaching at the Architectural Association in London. Pask's theory had a significant impact on Nicolas Negroponte's architecture machine group at MIT, which Pask advised on artificial intelligence and design. Gordon Pask passed away in London in 1996 at the age of 67. He could be described as a mechanic philosopher. He constructed machines, at every stage reflecting on the implications for the understanding of interaction as such, and thus built over the years an encompassing and richly explanatory theory of conversation. The most apt formulation for Pask's uniqueness, his extraordinary form of imagination, was found by the cybernetician Heinz von Förster. He commented on 2 drawings by Pask with the following words: "He just sees operational, functional, semantic, relational structures at an arbitrary depth, a faculty for which I have no organs, no senses, no language."
This was a glimpse into a tiny part of Gordon Pask's work, obviously heavily influenced by my interests as an art historian. And it already says something about the diversity of Gordon Pask's oeuvre that all 3 of us have been studying Gordon Pask for many years. Paul Pangarow, an interaction design specialist, Andrew Pickering, a historian of science, and myself, an art historian. Something what I had forgotten to mention, I had an AI program generate the music for this film. The fact that it sounds very melodic and a little bit old-fashioned was intentional, as I had tried to follow Gordon Pask's musical taste as far as I could tell from his music theatre experiments. But now to the introduction. I'd like to introduce briefly Paul Pangarow. He's a professor of practice at the Human-Computer Interaction Institute at Carnegie Mellon University and president of the American Society for Cybernetics. And he was a longtime collaborator of Gordon Pask. And since receiving his PhD in cybernetics, he has applied conversational models to interaction design and organizational design. For a long time, he chaired the MFA program in interaction design at the College for Creative Studies in Detroit. And in 2019, he joined the Human-Computer Interaction Institute at the School of Computer Science at Carnegie Mellon. Andrew Pickering is one of the international leading figures in the field of science and technology studies. After his PhDs in physics and science studies, he became a professor of sociology at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign until 2007, when he moved to the University of Exeter, from which he retired in 2015. In addition, he has taught and conducted research at numerous other universities and research institutes. And of all his publications, I would like to single out just a few with particular relevance to our discussion. And that is The Manual of Practice, Time, Agency and Science, Kybernetik und neue Ontologien, Cybernetics and New Ontologies, and The Cybernetic Brain, Sketches of Another Future. And Andrew is currently completing a book on our relations with the environment, acting with the world, doing without science, and he's thinking about a book on art and agency. There are many topics that we will address, but I would like to put our conversation under a motto. which I would formulate as follows. What were the promises of Gordon Pask? By this, I mean, which of his ideas may provide answers to questions of the present? But I would like to start with a historical situation question. Paul, when and under what circumstances did you meet Gordon, and what was your first impression?
I remember it well. I met Gordon Pask in a sunny day in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He was standing in the office of Nicholas Negroponte, who was a collaborator at the time. I had joined the research staff of the Architecture Machine Group. And he was a slight man of build, but extraordinarily powerful in presence. And he looked up at me and he said, "How do, Paul?" And that was the beginning of a long and complicated relationship, which I cherish to the day. He was a very probing character. He had a lot of ability to really zero in on you as an individual. And one-on-one, he was extraordinary and very, very with you and much in resonance and in sort of constant connection. He influenced the lab in many ways. The lab, unfortunately, morphed into something else. It became the Media Lab, and some of us think it lost its way. His influence and his intention was to create conversations with machines about design, in that case. But the general case, of course, was conversations in general, a theory of conversations, human to human, human to machine, and indeed, machine to machine.
I don't know, Andrea, did you ever meet Pask in person?
No, unfortunately, I didn't. As usual, I arrived too late. I started my research on the history of cybernetics after many of the principles had died. So
may I ask, I mean, you've written a lot about the history of cybernetics, and there were three persons you have singled out, like Ross Ashby, Stafford Beer, and Gordon Pask, who carried out groundbreaking work in the 1950s and 60s. What had sparked your interest in Pask? Why was he such an interesting case study?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, a long time ago, when I first got interested in cybernetics, I didn't really know what it was as a field. And I tried to read kind of popular descriptions of it. And they were all pretty boring about domestic thermostats and things like that. I felt there was something exciting there, but I didn't know what, I couldn't find out what it was. So I went back to the original writings of a whole range of cyberneticians, you know, including Norbert Wiener in America and Warren McCulloch. And I found myself very drawn, you know, coincidentally, to the work of British cyberneticians. So in the first generation, there was Ross Ashby and Greg Walter. In the second generation, there was Gordon Pask, his friend Stafford Beer, and Gregory Bateson, an Englishman in America, kind of ran through all this interesting stuff. And what fascinated me about the British cyberneticians in particular was the kind of projects that they embarked upon, the thing, you know, their worldly activities, not so much a theory of anything, but these systems that they built, which kind of often seem kind of magic to me. I mean, I thought, how on earth do you do that? They're all in some way focused upon adapting to an unknowable world, unknown world. How on earth can you do that? And you know, then assemblages like Gordon's Colloquy of Mobiles were, you know, concrete things that I became very interested in and attracted to. I liked them very much.
In the text in the short film, I had mentioned that Pask described himself as a mechanic philosopher. So it's also about the question of the things he built.
Yeah.
And that he was a theorist that at every stage of development of theory felt compelled to embody the theory in these awkward artifacts. And in my study of Pask, I found it partly easier to look first at the machines and the descriptions of what they did and the interactions than to approach his work through the texts. I would therefore start to talk about a machine that I'm particularly fond of, and that's Musicolour. Because that might be a way for us also to approach what that is, that so-called conversation theory. And Musicolour is this moody light organ. And maybe for those who don't know it, and most of us don't know Musicolour, Paul, could you describe again how this machine worked? And maybe you can also say, what was Pask trying to learn by creating a capricious machine? And maybe also what paradigms of interaction that still apply today would he challenge?
Well, Musicolour in the 1950s is difficult to imagine, partly because of where they went with it. They built, namely Gordon Pask, his then fiancée, later to be wife Elizabeth, and another crony, Robin McKinnon Wood. They built this apparatus that they would take around the music halls of England and set up, and there would be 5 lights that would be displayed on scrims, essentially sheets hung in a music hall environment. And they would invite a musician to play, often with a keyboard. And although it sounds like a light organ kind of thing where the musician plays and you see color, it was much more interesting, as you're hinting, Margit, in your description. What happened was, if a musician was playing in a particular range of notes, say middle C to C above C, the system would adjust itself in a cybernetic fashion such that it would show something. So it would adjust its sensitivity such that it would show its lights about 50% of the time. But then if the musician stayed in that frequency range, Musicolour got bored. This was the word that Pask would use. And so it would shift the frequency that it was listening in. So it would slowly react less and less to the musician. Now the musician is playing, delighted that this thing is responding, and all of a sudden it would stop responding. So what would the musician do? Of course, they would be drawn into a desire to change what they were doing in order to get a reaction. So capricious is not a bad term, but it was diabolically designed to engage. And how it worked, of course, was just an electromechanical apparatus for which Pask and company were very, very proud, because apparently it was switching kilowatts of power with ease, although it did occasionally, what do we say, Andy? It exploded or it caught fire, or things like this. These were the stories that were told. But what was he trying to learn? That's a very important question. And it goes back to your comment about, did one come before the other? Did the theory come first, or did the experiment come first? And I have trouble, and I've talked to others, Bernard Scott, for example, about this. It's difficult to say whether he was a theorist first and then a maker, or whether he was a maker first and then a theorist. We feel that these two things co-emerged. He had an idea for an interaction. He embodied it in a machine, and then he hypothesized about how this might work in the broader realm of kinds of interactions, all the way up into conversation. So you could look at this laddering of his machines and his characterizations of them with models, and ultimately into a theory called conversation theory, with books of that name. The theory being a consequence of this laddering up of hypotheses and playing and hypotheses and playing. What it says today is enormous. It's a constant theme in my teaching and in the systems I've tried to build over the years since I met Pask, which is a very different theory of interaction. You can oversimplify perhaps, but I think correctly characterize digital interaction as the machine wanting to be the agent of choosing. And then it says, hi, would you like to look at this? Oh no? Okay. Would you like to look at this? Oh, you would? Okay. And then it gives you more of what you're selecting from. And of course, there's machine learning all behind it. That's one way of doing it. Pask is the absolute opposite. It's what is the individual doing? What is the context of the individual? and what is happening now such that the machine reacts in the moment. As a friend of mine likes to say, recommendation engines which are based on the past, you might as well be dead, because it's giving you a choice that's about you before now. What do you want now? What is the thing that you would like to do now? So Pask's machines were always about the now, and always about this agency being shared between the human and the machine. And Andrew has written eloquently about the idea of cybernetics as a dance. And I think Pask is a great example of that. Would you say, Andy?
The interesting thing about Musicolour in very general terms is that it's a kind of opaque other that you have to get along with to create a performance. You couldn't see through a Musicolour machine to know how it would respond if you played the next note. You just had to interact with it in this kind of what I call a back and forth process of a dance of agency. The human being does something, the machine responds, the human being responds to that. And the show, a Musicolour performance, is a kind of co-production of both elements. And that back and forth, that dance of agency, for me is the key thing that's always in the foreground of cybernetics as it developed in Britain, right? And Pask is a beautiful exemplification of how you would go on if you were fascinated by dances of agency.
I found it really interesting how important the actually making things was for the development of the whole model. But now I really would like to ask you a favor, I would almost say. If I've read a large number of definitions of the conversation theory, and I gave up in a way to formulate it in my own words. So as you both are the two specialists to ask, would you dare to say in a few words what conversation theory is for you? And I am afraid that it's similar to if I ask somebody for a definition of cybernetics, that everybody will give me a different answer. But would you give it a try? Maybe, Andrea, would you like to start?
Yeah, I can easily start. I haven't got the faintest idea what conversation theory is. I've done my best to try and understand it. I've got the basic idea that Pask wanted to emphasize something like conversation, a kind of open-ended back and forth, another one of these dances of agency. But when it gets to the theory and the big books that Pask wrote, I can understand most things, but I'm completely in the dark. So you'll have to ask Paul Pangarian.
Paul.
Well, one summary of conversation theory is in the beginning was the interaction, because the foundation of conversation is the idea that you only know things through interaction, whether you're a human agent in an exchange of some kind, or whether you're a scientist trying to study something. So Pask studied interactions between humans and machines, and humans and humans, and humans and machines, all combinations. He studied them all, and he began to characterize them in a cybernetic way, which is, what is the dance, as Andy would put it? What is the relationship between what one agent does, causing a response, cause, carefully chosen word, and what is the response that comes as a result of that response? And that formal cybernetic loop became the essence of it all. And by starting with simple interactions, so the Musicolour description, or extending that into learning how to do touch typing, where the system, the keyboard instructor, gets harder and harder and harder, but when the human fails because it's too hard, it gets easier. So it's constantly adapting, it's hunting in the cybernetic sense, it's regulating the exchange such that at all points, it is challenging the human, but not over-challenging them such that they fail. He then later extended through a series of machines that I'll skip over, the same idea in a cognitive space where he wanted people to learn concepts like Kings of England or statistics, and wanted to challenge them and to see how they could learn new things but not be barraged by material such that they would be overwhelmed and confused. And in this way, he started from simple interactions through cognitive learning interactions and created, here's my summary, a theory of everything. Because remember, it starts from, in the beginning was the interaction. You can only know things through interactions. So he built that theory all the way up to encompass what we're doing now, what we do in our own heads when we think of things and we compare what we know to what we're experiencing, and indeed to schools of thought. These were the three domains of conversation that he spoke of quite often, where opposing viewpoints in communities or in politics or what have you, in a sense, are having conversations about the ideas. The other eloquent phrase, which is worthwhile, that I know, Margit, you've used, which is, it's a theory of theory building. Because when I learn something from you, I'm building a theory of what I think you mean. And this is part of the whole dynamic.
May I add a question, which I'm a little bit unsure, but if it's also a theory of communication, are there preconditions for a successful conversation? For example, like a balance of power, a benevolence, or did Pask ever address questions of conflict in conversations? I mean, admittedly, the question came to my mind given the current situation in Europe.
Shall I jump in, Andy? Is that okay?
Yeah, by all means.
Communication is a subset of conversation, I think is one way to say it, as per defined here. In other words, you can think of these words as somewhat interchangeable depending on where you start from. But what Pask would say is, if I tell you something that confirms the possibilities that you already know, I'm communicating. It's cold out, I'm sitting in a chair. But if we're having a reflexive interchange in which new ideas emerged and you learn other things about me that you didn't know or that you didn't know were possible, then that's conversation. So surely conflict is a very important part of that, where you might disagree with me, you might misunderstand me, we might argue, argumentation, rhetorical exchanges, all of those things are fully encompassed in Pask's theory of conversation. Power is more complicated because the power is outside the exchange. So if I'm talking to someone who has power over me because they're holding a gun to my head, or because I work for them, or because they control something in my life that I can't control, that's exterior to the conversation, but surely it's part of the dynamic of what goes inside.
Yeah, if I could just add something to that. Maybe Pask isn't really the person we want to think about here. You go back to Ross Ashby, from whom all the other cyberneticians learned a lot. And he envisaged two different situations. One is the one that we've all been talking about so far, where a couple of systems are reciprocally adapting to one another. That's a kind of intrinsically democratic, non-hierarchical interaction. That's the model for being in the world that interests me. But Ashby also talked about things like war. He saw war as being, imposing your will on the other party by refusing to adapt. You had, instead of, the Musicolour machine adapting to you and you adapting to the Musicolour machine, one partner would just stand fixed and the other partner had to go through a series of transformations to try and adapt. That was his model of warfare. That is a kind of cybernetic analysis of asymmetric power relations. So, you could talk about doctors and patients in a hospital. The doctors in a conventional hospital are staying the same all the time and trying to make the patient somehow adapt to them in the name of getting better. So hierarchical relationship.
Thank you for that. I would return now to the objects and specifically to the Colloquy of Mobiles. Gordon Pask had designed it as a, as he said, aesthetically potent environment. So my question to you, what effect did Pask hope to have, or that this environment hoped to have on the public? And also, what did he hope to be able to observe? Because in a way, this was also, you could also say it's an experiment with visitors to observe their behavior.
I think, you know, his idea, his aesthetic theory was that an aesthetically potent environment would somehow draw people in. It was something you could engage with performatively in this kind of back and forth process. And I think, according to Pask, it was important that you thought you were getting somewhere, kind of moving towards a solution of a problem. That was his aesthetics of performative interaction. Then you'd have to try and think of what is it like to interact with the colloquy. Certainly when it was displayed in London in 1968, people, you know, women used makeup mirrors and things like that to interact with the light beams. In as much as those interactions are successful, I suppose, the colloquy would be describable as an aesthetically potent environment. It's certainly a pretty thing, but being pretty isn't the same as that aesthetic conception. Right? That's my very simple answer. Paul, what is the full answer?
If you look back at his statements about aesthetically potent environments, he's going beyond, of course, the visual, and he talks a lot about novelty. And he has this wonderful quote where he says, humans are always seeking novelty, and having found it, seek to control it, with a careful sense of the word control, which is often misunderstood in cybernetics. We witness this when a child is walking around a supermarket where they've never been before, and they're playing with things, and they're picking up things, and they're crawling up the shelves. They're using it in a way that's novel because they're trying to understand it. And Pask would say that this is universal to human beings. So when I hear aesthetically potent environment, I like to make sure that it expands out to the interactive qualities and the aesthetics of the interaction and the novelty found in those interactions. And the richness of that is what he was experimenting with. Now, the beauty of colloquy, one of the beauties, aside from how they look, as Andy said, is they are interacting with themselves. The mobiles of the colloquy are entirely on their own, which I think was unique for the time. Many people made robots, and those robots often had an interactivity with the environment or with humans in the environment. But this robot to robot thing, I believe, was new then. That's something that one can confirm historically. Certainly the aesthetic, now the visual aesthetic qualities of those things, the females, the so-called males and so on. And the idea that they would interact through these messages with sound and light and have this dance, and ultimately, in his terms, would achieve a kind of satisfaction through the interaction and so on and so forth. There's a richness here. He was a playful character, Pask, and he was also interested in theater. So I often think of it as a theatrical experiment as much as it is a cybernetic experiment, if you will. Now, the interactivity, as Andy said, makeup mirrors and flashlights and so on, that was real. And the way I know it was real is because a man I knew who funded both Pask and myself for some years, his name was Joe Zeidner, and he ran the Army Research Institute, which was essentially a passel of psychologists looking at decision-making and so on for the US government in Washington, DC. The reason why Joe Zeidner ended up funding Pask was because he wandered into the gallery of Cybernetic Serendipity one day and found this thing. And as he told me, he played with it for hours. And he was so fascinated by it, he said, who made this? I want to meet that guy. And did, and then funded him for a very long period of time. So there was something going on there, which was new and which a psychologist of Zeidner's caliber could recognize as somehow valuable and worth understanding who made this and how did he make it. As I say, I think he hoped for the theatricality of an environment in which something like this would take place. On the public, I think he wanted them to play and to understand a little bit what it might be like to play with robots. What did he observe? I'm not sure. I think he observed that it worked sometimes better than others, as his machines always did. And he certainly was delighted in it many, many years later when I met him, 10 years or so after Colloquy occurred in 1968. And I'll tell one further story. In the back garden of the Pask house in Montague Road in Richmond upon Thames, Surrey, England, was one of the carapace of the females. And Gordon's young daughters would use it and play tea and things with it as a kind of plaything in the back. So one day when I pointed to it and I said, what's that? The story emerged, and that's how I learned about it.
As we're talking about communicating machines, I would like to return to another point. I mean, when Norbert Wien in 1948 published his Cybernetics, it was spectacular to have machines with sense organs and effectors and equivalent of a nervous system. But now we're surrounded by countless machines that listen to us, that watch us from our smartwatches, Alexa, computer screens identifying us, or our cars that telling us we're tired and that we have to pull over. And I mean, Gordon Pask imagined a world in which machines don't just answer questions, but which actively involve us in conversations. And that's what's actually happening now. So where is the difference between what Pask had imagined and dreamt of and what has actually materialized today?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, one answer to start off with is that Pask was deliberately building devices and robots or whatever to engage people, that would encourage you to act in such a way that then the machine would act. Like the back and forth between the musician and Musicolour, or the back and forth between the different robots in the Colloquy of Mobiles. They're all constructively interacting. It seems to me, I don't know what you and Paul think, but most of the related technological developments these days are acting to disengage us from the world rather than engage us. They're kind of solipsistic technologies that split us, human beings, dualistically off from the world rather than entangling us with interesting machines like Musicolour and the Colloquy. You know, my simple example is something like self-driving cars. At least these days when I'm driving my car, I still turn the steering wheel and change gear. I don't switch the lights on anymore. They switch themselves on, right? This is disengagement. I don't switch the windscreen wipers. But I'm still doing something and still have a skillful engagement with the world. But so much of the thrust of modern, contemporary digital culture is to produce willing servants that you don't engage with, you just think something and give them an order. That seems to be one aspect in which cybernetic technologies are different from, the sort of things that Google is offering us these days.
I would agree tenfold. I think the desire of today's platform companies, Google, Facebook, Twitter, whatever they may be, they have their own goals, and the human is a cog in those goals, to use that cliche of a mechanism. I think you're exactly right, Andy. Pask was all about what is the engagement and what is the value of the engagement to the human. what new comes to the human as a consequence. Again, Musicolour, as you point out, is a perfect example. It's causing something to be new. It's changing the environment in a way that pulls the human in the way that a real conversation with a real human pulls people in, and the way that his conversational machines later, we haven't mentioned this, but ThoughtSticker is the example of the cognitive learning environment where the purpose is to help the human learn things in their own terms to some extent, but also to challenge them and not let them be complacent or learn slowly, but rather to make it more interesting, more challenging until it becomes so difficult that the machine backs off, again, like a good teacher tracking where the student is. What I claim is that there is a culture around the digital algorithms that we have today. It's partly driven by profit in the platform companies, but it's also driven by the nature of how we've come, who are absorbed into the digital culture, tend to think of things like interaction. So for us, an interaction is we're offered something by the machine and we say yes or no. Now we might make some choices within it, but it's predicting an enormous amount and we have no agency in that prediction and what it's about. What if instead we were allowed to, when offered something, ask, thank you, why did you offer me that movie to watch? Why do you want me to buy that thing? Rather than assume that I'm going to understand why it's offered. No, I don't really know why it's offered. If I have a friend offer me something, I can say, well, why do you want to go to that movie? Or why do you want to eat there? And that conversation gives me agency and engages me in the decision process. But if you have a machine learning model, which everyone loves, right? It's magic. It has 1 trillion nodes and it computes over blah, blah, blah. And it says, hey, you should choose this. That's not about me. That's about some average that the digital culture says it can make. And sure, it's using some data points about who I am and what I've done, but it's not about me now. It's about some aggregation of millions of people and billions of clicks and how I fit as a little tiny wisp in that such that it can make a profit in the choice that I make.
If I may comment on that, I would probably enjoy living with a number of trivial machines that evolve also through misunderstanding and tend to surprise me, though hopefully in not a lethal way. But my sole worry, and this is the worry of the time, is that I lose the control of my data. If there would be solutions where we keep the control of our data, I would embrace this technology probably even more. In a way, I stay in the question, or in the field of AI and machine learning that Paul just mentioned. In describing the machines and their behavior, Gordon Pask often used words which you would normally just apply to living beings, like organism, being bored, being neurotic or whatever. And of course, he was also using the term intelligence. And the question of intelligence was answered by computing science and also by cybernetics, robotics, in a lot of different ways. What was Pask's take on intelligence, and why is this maybe specifically interesting?
Again, I think it helps to go back to the previous generation and Ross Ashby. Ashby was a psychiatrist like Warren McCulloch and other founders of Cybernetic. So he thought about the brain all the time. But he made this very interesting contrast. He said most people think of the brain as a thinking machine. Cyberneticians understand the brain as an acting machine. And you can see two different traditions of work emerging from that contrast. So if you think of the brain as a thinking machine, you get into symbolic AI, good old-fashioned AI, as it's called, moving symbols around, as a, copying that sort of thing that's happening in your brain. Whereas cybernetics, for me, took off from this idea that the brain is an acting machine. It helps us get along in a world that we've never experienced before. And it does that by this kind of performative trial and error, back and forth, dance of agency kind of thing that I was talking about earlier on, and that Pask's work exemplifies. And the funny thing is that traveling down that route, he came back to the world of concepts and cognition, but understood in the frame of still in the frame of a back and forth between, myself and this machine that's teaching me to type, or that's trying to help me learn a concept or something like that. So I think that split between, whether the brain is a thinking machine or an acting machine helps us understand what's going on here, what the cyberneticians are about.
I think that distinction of thinking versus acting is perfect. In the sense that that's what AI thinks it does. It puts the thinking in the machine.
Yeah.
Pask, I think, would say that intelligence is a consequence of an interaction. It's not in one side or the other. It's a manifestation of a dynamic rather than something that's in. And the implications of that are many. It also implies that, well, this would go off into a long harangue. I have a long complaint that this digital culture has assumptions about interaction in terms of offering you a choice and then not minding that you don't have agency in that choice. That's one aspect. There's interaction, there's intelligence, again, thought of as something that's inside something rather than interactional. And even the idea of information is wrong from an AI point of view. Information is something that comes to me in a sentence, and the information is in the sentence, according to AI. According to cybernetics, the sentence is a trigger for me to manifest what I already know and put it together with what this trigger is in the message for me to understand the intention of what's coming my way. So these three I's of interaction, intelligence, and information have one interpretation in the digital realm and a very different interpretation in the cybernetic realm. And the consequence is dire, because we end up with machines doing to us what they do today, which is making assumptions, taking away our agency, and making us think that just because they're smaller, cheaper, faster, that's a good thing.
So may I ask you, Paul, did I understand it correctly also that when Pask was looking at a system of two actors communicating, be it machine, machine, man, machine, that he said it would not be possible to say the intelligence is either in the human or in the machine, but that it is in the conversation, in the exchange?
That is my view. Now, there's some nuance there where you can look inside my head and you can realize that I am smart when I am thinking about something and doing a calculation, but that calculation is also very likely to be me having a conversation and an interaction inside myself. I'm walking down the street. Oh, there's something in the way. I better step out of the way. Did you step out of the way? Yes. That's a kind of conversation. So you could say that I'm intelligent, but also I'm capable in the context of that street of behaving that way. I have a favorite example of this, which is I have a brilliant friend who is so stupid when he's walking around New York City that he nearly gets killed. Now, is he an intelligent person? Yes, we would say that, but not in New York City, because he doesn't know where to look. He doesn't know how the dynamics of taxi drivers and delivery people on bicycles going the wrong way down one-way streets and so on and so forth. So I think that's a demonstration by example that we are seduced by these digital points of view and AI. And every day I read in the press, this machine is getting more intelligent. This machine is almost conscious. You know, pretty soon we've got the capability of doing a general intelligence because we've got 1 trillion neurons and all we need is 5 trillion and we'll be done. This is nonsense. This has been talked about for decades. Andy was alluding to the AI time when it was symbolic AI and so on. That had its own bad assumptions, which cybernetics has some corrections for. And now we have neural nets, which also has some bad assumptions. The irony is, of course, neural nets came from cybernetics, but that's a story of another time.
Andrew, you have been studying the whole field of cybernetics for so many ways. You've seen all this, what I would call this cybernetic zoo and all these artworks related to cybernetics. Could you maybe contextualize a little bit so I would call the neighborhoods of the Colloquy of Mobiles.
Yes. I mean, one way to think about it is to ask yourself how something like the colloquy fits into art history. Where's it coming from? Where's it going to? So one of the origin points I would think about would be the so-called robotic turtles or tortoises built by Craig Walter in 1948. He didn't describe them as art objects at all, but they were little interactive robots that Walter thought of as models of the brain, the performative brain. It helps you get around. Actually, to go back a bit to what Paul said, if you want to talk about interacting robots, Craig Walter built several of these tortoises which did interact with one another, rather like the elements of the colloquy later on. But I find it interesting to think of a whole historical trajectory of artworks that lead out of these tortoises. So, you know, the next interactive robot that people call the first cybernetic artwork is CYSP, this robot that Nicholas Schoffer built in the 1950s. Edward Inatovich built these amazing machines that would try and find people and move towards them. Sam, that was shown at the ICA at the same time as the Colloquy of Mobiles. Senster, which was a much more spectacular machine, built after that. And that runs all the way up to the present. I mean, as is no doubt very clear at the ZKM, that's where these kind of interacting machines come from. At the same time, we haven't really talked about the fact that before the Colloquy of Mobiles was the Fun Palace, where Pask was involved in the design of a building that engaged in these kind of decentered dances with the people who inhabited it. And that gives rise to, you know, an endless tradition of interactive architecture, which Paul did talk about somewhat. So, I mean, it's interesting to think about the overall flow of the art world around the colloquy. The other way of contextualizing it, the way I came upon it, is to think about it in relation to the history of cybernetics as part of a whole constellation of cybernetics project. And then you would see a lot of cross connections between the colloquy, which is in the art world, and a certain kind of robotics, which starts with Craig Walter and turns into Rodney Brooks at MIT in the 1980s. Stafford Beer, his designs for adaptive organizations, things like that. The world of psychiatry and anti-psychiatry. So there's a whole other way of contextualizing the colloquy outside the art world. And I often wonder about the kind of biographical context of Pask's work. How did he end up building the colloquy, right? Why is he doing that a few years after he'd been involved in the Fun Palace? But I really don't know the answer to the biographical question. Probably Paul does.
I'm very thankful for bringing up all these ancestors, predecessors of the colloquy. I mean, now it is surrounded by its descendants in the exhibition Biomedia, being surrounded by all these little robots communicating with each other.
Yeah.
And it's interesting also when the younger artists suddenly discover the colloquy and see what has been there and what is still not a part of a canon which you just know, just like you would know the Mona Lisa or something like that. I would like to comment briefly on Nicolas Schoffer and his robot, and also on the Fun Palace, because what I found so interesting that this opens up a total new scale, it's not about me and a robot, but what Nicolas Schöffer was imagining, where these cities populated with cybernetic objects, moving sculptures, towers answering to change of traffic and light. Also the Fun Palace would bring this interaction not to this urbanistic level, but at least to this architectural level. And this is really a topic which is not so much explored, because we very often tend to describe just this one-on-one relations of me to the robot, though the architectural and urbanistic scale would be so interesting.
Could I make a comment?
Yes, please.
Build on Andy's comment. I can't improve on Andy's remarks about the art lineage, or yours, Margit. But there's a parallel universe in the world of interaction design and learning machines, which are two threads, somewhat related, but also somewhat independent. And I have the same experience almost daily, and I don't exaggerate, when there's an opportunity to present to a design student, an interaction design student, an architecture student, the concepts inside of Pask's ideas. And inevitably, the student finds it fascinating and amazed that they didn't know about it before. And it opens a world to them of thinking and seeing in a way that reminds me of what happened to me the first day I met Pask, which was a new way of thinking about interaction, intelligence, conversation, and ultimately the building of systems that are more electronic and happen to be digital, but nonetheless support the analog qualities of being human. And I'm gratified that, having thought of these ideas for some time, and I stand on the shoulders of Pask and others in cybernetics, that there is a current generation, I don't know what happened in between, who's hungry for these because they see that it is different. Maybe what was required was the dominance of the digital culture had to come along and slam everybody against the wall. And the truth of that was unavoidable. The bad truth of that was unavoidable. So now they really are looking for alternatives in interaction types and allowing more agency. And as we've said a few times, enabling an engagement that Andy keeps on going back to. The engagement is the thing that Pask always wanted. You saw this in traveling with him and watching him with individuals. He could engage someone behind a counter at an airport in minutes in ways that were astounding. He can engage someone, the girlfriend of a friend sort of thing, who happened to be along in a conversation, and she would talk about that conversation with Pask for years. I'm not exaggerating. He somehow was always interested in this moment-to-moment engagement. He wasn't always nice. He wasn't always polite. He was a difficult teacher. But this was the essence of him, and I think it manifests in the machines he wanted to build as an exploration of understanding what it means to be human and to be engaged in the world and with others.
I would like to finish with a last question about a very specific aspect. There was one theme that caught my eye when I was reading Pask, and that is the question of attention, of being attentive, concentrated. Like when he was talking about teaching machines or other industrial applications, his biggest concern was that the requirements are too simple or too repetitive, and that people may become underwhelmed. And then this would lead to daydreaming, and they would ultimately make a lot of mistakes at work. And in an article which he wrote with Heinz von Förster in 1960, they both wrote, man must make decisions about something in order to be man. And he also made this argument with regard to the cybernetic theater, and argues that attention can be held only if people can make decisions and of course the decisions that have an external effect. And he also states that this state of attention, that immersion in that situation, seems to be associated with a feeling of happiness or fulfillment. In this sense, I know that Pask adored painting, but in this sense, interactive art, where you constantly have to click on something or move something, would be the only true art form. So my question is, does this model of focus, of attention, that is kept by constant stimulation, does this derive from his theory, or does this also have to do something with his personality?
I think there's a richness in his interpretation of attention and interaction. And I think some of his writing is clear that I can have an interaction in my head. I can have a conversation with myself about something if that something is rich enough. So I can lose myself in a painting because there are so many aspects of it, so many dimensions that I invent my exploratory path for, that I think it doesn't have to be a clickable situation for his ideas and the kind of engagement that he was focused on to be present and to be rich and true. Maybe that's the difference between some kinds of art and other kinds of art, rather than the difference being clickable art and passive art, let's call it. He talks a lot about the conversations that we have with ourselves that we don't think of as conversations, that really are, because they're exchanges of information across differing points of view. It's an internal dialectic where we travel forward and we create theories about what other people think. We create theories about what the artist meant in the painting. And we live in this theory making of constantly moving forward, wanting the novel, wanting to experience the new and the engaging because it is new.
Right. I mean, okay, I can have a bash at this question too. I mean, it's a great question. Of course, Paul's answer was great too. It's the old question about the aesthetically potent environment again. An aesthetically potent environment is one that somehow precisely pulls you in and commands your attention, keeps you involved with it. The one thing that we could add here is that there are different ways of grasping people's attention. So the whole critique of, the internet and Google and Facebook, etc., is that the kind of attention that gets grabbed is the kind of lower reaches of your brain, the kind of animal parts, that the reptilian brain that is just fascinated by disasters or something like that, or terribly controversial political views and stuff like that. So, the internet is a powerful way of grasping people's attention, but the kind of attention that it grasps is not the attention that anybody really wants. And that is the nice contrast with the machines that Pask and everybody else built, and that Paul keeps speaking in favor of. That you could be in favor of the kind of grabbing of attention that the colloquy does, in contrast to Facebook, Google intention. So, and I think that's worth thinking about.
I think the wonderful thing is when I look at the visitors in our exhibitions, and we have what Paul calls passive art and clickable art, I may add that to our vocabulary, that it is not that one culture technique of spectatorship would replace the other and erase it, but we have both to look and to click and to interact. But of course, I have to say, both has to be learned and repeated, because you might unlearn how it is to look at a painting for 5 minutes. but people still do
yes.
that.
We unlearn what it means. We unlearn what it means to have a conversation with someone else because we're in front of our screens all the time.
I would like to say thank you to you, Paul and Andrew. And though I adore daydreaming, a word which Pask never used in a positive sense as far as I read it, I truly hope that we manage to keep the attention of the people who watched. And Pask once said that a conversation must meet a certain requirement to be a real conversation, and that is that at the end of a conversation, all conversation partners have changed. And of course, I hope we had a real conversation. I hope that we've done that.
Absolutely.
So thank you again, Paul and Andrew, for accepting the invitation to participate in this conversation. And I really hope that we will meet as we planned later this year in front of the Colloquy in the exhibition.
I can't wait for that. And Margita, I want to pay a tribute to you for your interest in the Colloquy and in Pask for so many years, and all of your support for the Colloquy project. It really mattered a lot to have you so interested, and also Andy's support as part of the advisory committee was also wonderful.
It's a pleasure. So thank you for your attention, and I wish you a good time. Goodbye.